flashback scenes in A Handmaid's Tale gives us insight into the early signs that the characters missed and that you probably missed, both in the show and frankly in real life. And if you guys want more Handmaid's Tale analysis, please let me know and join me on here. I'd really appreciate it. One of the earliest warning signs that we get is actually from Janine's flashback. What happened to her showed early signs of a strong cultural divide to the far right, and it's a sign that we actually had in real life and that I think a lot of people missed. Now, Janine is already a mother to her son Caleb, right? But she hooks up with a guy and she ends up pregnant. She really does not want to keep the baby. So she makes an appointment at a facility that is going to help her terminate. At least she thinks she's getting help at a facility that will help her terminate. But when she gets there, she's immediately questioned by this woman. She's told how dangerous it would be to have the procedure, how it would affect her future fertility if she did get the procedure, and that there's such a big fertility problem. They need babies, and so she really should consider keeping her baby. And Janine rightfully says, like, this is my choice. I'm going to have the procedure. At which point the woman tells her that they don't even do that procedure there. Because what it actually is a crisis pregnancy center. Now, these were something that very much existed in real life. For decades, these places that are not in any way medical facilities had marketed themselves to women who were not sure what to do about their pregnancy under the guise that they would help them with their decision. Now, to most people, that sounds like they have the option to choose, but there was really only one choice if you went to one of these facilities. So not only are they trapping scared potential mothers, but they also very often would try to delay scheduling the appointment. So they would think that they were making an appointment for the procedure when really they were making an appointment just to get spoken to, with the hope that it would delay it so long that they no longer could get the procedure. They were extremely predatory places, but they were largely ignored in the Handmaid's Tale world, and they were ignored in our world. I think for Janine, it was easy to brush the center off as just like a place that's being run by a bunch of wackos. Like, yes, you guys are wild, but you're the minority of people. You're never actually going to interfere with the right of a woman to choose. And I really empathize with Janine for this reason, because that was largely my belief for years. Like, the people who are anti-pro-choice are a very loud minority, but you're never going to take away a right that women have had for 30 years, right? But now look at where we are in America. Roe v. Wade has very much been overturned, and look where they ended up in Gilead, because ignoring this very organized political organization on the right was a mistake. That was a sign of things that were to come. Now, Janine does eventually get to a doctor, but even there, she's told that the procedure is dangerous. And then the doctor kind of slyly says, like, hey, they make me say that, but it's perfectly safe, and here are the pills that you need. But this too is a very scary sign, because it showed that the law was starting to interfere with what doctors were allowed to say, that doctors were being forced to say things that were not scientifically true. And doctors being told what they are or were not allowed to say was a big push forward into our next flashback, where June is going to get her birth control, and she is told that she needs her husband to sign off on it. Now, this is obviously a big step up from what we saw with Janine, right? Janine was just being warned that the procedure might be dangerous, and that also is easy to brush off, because, like, hey, okay, fine, you can make doctors say that, but you're not actually changing anything for any woman who wants the procedure, right? But it was a slippery slope, and ignoring that first early warning sign made it possible for them to start creating laws to regulate what women could have birth control or not. It's like June says in the show, if you were thrown into a pot of boiling water, you would just jump out. But if somebody just slowly turns up the temperature, you'll boil alive and you won't even notice. Now, obviously, this was designed as a larger push to get women to have more babies, but it's so alarming because birth control is a medication that has uses far beyond controlling not getting pregnant. I, for example, am a woman with endometriosis, and I take birth control to control my pain. And if I didn't have it, I would be entirely disabled. Prior to getting on birth control, I was in severe debilitating pain 3 weeks out of the month. But differentiating birth control from real medication was really crucial for Gilead to control it. Now, June is like a little alarmed by this, but she's not so alarmed that she wants to go like riot in the streets about it, because at the end of the day, there was a huge jump between needing your husband to sign for your birth control and Gilead, right? Except it wasn't really that big of a leap at all. And these laws had to happen in order for a cultural shift in America to happen. And I know that's going to confuse people, because laws don't determine culture, right? We don't go out and legislate personal values, people decide that for themselves, right? Except we kind of do. Because the laws that are passed are allowed to change our cultural perception of things. For example, think back to when gay marriage was legalized. In 2014, only a few years before gay marriage was legalized, only 55% of people approved of gay marriage. And by 2018, just a few years after gay marriage was legalized, 67% of people approved of gay marriage. Our laws do precede our social values, and we start to see those social values change in the Serena flashback. Because Serena was a staunch advocate of Gilead. She was a very public figure. She was writing best-selling books, advocating for their values, because the sons of Jacob really needed that. Even though they didn't respect women, they needed a woman to go out and advocate for their values because it just sounded too sexist coming from a man. So Serena was a very public right-wing figure. But again, you'll notice a pattern here. She was easy to ignore because her opinions were not the majority opinion. We see her go onto a college campus, and she is so hated for what she's talking about that the students are booing her and screaming at her until she can no longer speak at all. And the fact that she's being shut up by the majority of people makes her really easy to underestimate. But let's not forget who she was and who she was organizing with behind the scenes. Because the sons of Jacob were a well-oiled machine, and they did not need majority opinion to get done the things that they needed to get done. They just needed to shift some people's opinion. And Serena was doing that. We see that when she leaves her original speech, she stops in the hallway and she tries to speak again, and she successfully does. And a few people do cheer her on. Because ultimately, she is speaking to a problem that people do really care about, the fertility crisis, and she uses that as a vessel to get her right-wing views across. And at the end of the day, all they needed was some people on their side, some people who were going to quietly support, some people who were going to allow this to happen, because if everyone was against the sons of Jacob, this wouldn't have worked out. And Serena did have a lot of cultural influence. We saw that influence manifesting in the coffee shop scene with June and Moira. Now, I know you're expecting me to talk about the way that June got stared at when she was going for a run, or the way that the barista called June and Moira a slur, but that is not what is most interesting to me about this scene, because I already knew from other scenes that cultural opinions were starting to shift. What's interesting here is what corporate opinion is starting to shift. Because we know in the scene that June is not yet fired. That happens in coming days, weeks, maybe even a month after this scene. So when June asks, hey, where is my usual barista, my female barista, we know she's been fired, but she wasn't forced to be fired. There are no eyes in this coffee shop controlling what they do yet. This company volunteered to fire their employee. They were complying with the cultural shift before it was required that they comply, which means that corporations saw what was coming, and corporations were starting to get behind it. And this is ultimately America. Corporations often do have heavy influence in our society. Once corporations started to make these changes that Gilead wanted, it was rapidly downhill from there. Which brings me to my final flashback, the one that has the most dramatic, obvious sign that people still very much missed. And that's a scene where there is a terror attack on the Capitol. Now, June is obviously bothered by this, but she still doesn't see it as a sign of greater things to come. She experiences normalcy bias, which is a bias that up to 70% of people experience prior to a catastrophe. It's a bias in our brain that basically tells us, hey, things are going to continue the way they have continued, so you really don't need to worry that much, even when you've got evidence that you should be worried. And as we know, this terror attack was used to enact martial law. Martial law is a very real thing that can be enacted in the US, and it does suspend the Constitution. But obviously, suspending the Constitution is a very big deal. People are going to freak out if you do it. So you need people to be on board, because as much as they'd like you to believe that the government is this huge monolith that we cannot control, they are ultimately controlled by the people. If everyone lashed out because the Constitution was being ignored, the government would have to respond to that. So they needed to create a situation where people were okay with suspending their own rights. And we know from history that one way to do that is to get people afraid. We saw this in fairly recent history in America. After September 11th, people were very afraid at that time. And so when they enacted the Patriot Act that took away privacy rights of a lot of US citizens, people didn't mind, because the Patriot Act was supposed to suss out potential terrorists, and people didn't want this to happen again. They were terrified of it happening again. So they were like, sure, if you want to do a little bit of spying on me, I think I can get on board with that for my safety. That is what you need. You need to get people to trade their freedom for safety. And a good way to do that is with something called a false flag attack. Now, that is when you fake an event in order to sway public opinion. It is something that very much has happened in fascist regimes in the past. For example, it was not popular in public opinion in Germany to invade Poland. So, to convince the people that they needed to invade Poland, what Germany did is they staged an attack at the border where they had their own troops dress up in Polish uniform and start shooting at people. And they even took bodies out of concentration camps, put them in Polish uniforms, and put them outside the border to make it look like the Polish soldiers had passed away there from fire from German soldiers. And then Germany said, hey, look, they're attacking us. We need to invade. And that worked. That changed public opinion. People believed that that happened and they were swayed by it. And it worked in Gilead. Like June said, people were more than willing to give up their rights because they were scared of the terror attack. People did not wake up when they suspended the Constitution. People still ultimately believed that they were doing that to protect Americans and not to usher in a fascist regime. And it was really the only way that it could be done, because my personal belief is there is nothing more dangerous in America than to ignore the Constitution. That is when you create a pathway for fascism to just walk right in, which is why what happened in Gilead is really believable to me. And the early signs that people ignored was also really believable to me, because like I said, up to 70% of people will experience normalcy bias in a catastrophe.